Hey guys, so today we'll be talking about reading and analyzing characters in our historical fiction unit. So we'll be going back and discussing some topics and some of our read alouds and some of the characters. But we're going to be taking it a step deeper today in our reading. So the goal for today is that we want to talk about perspective or the point of view of our characters. So we may be talking about the perspectives of the main characters and their experiences. But we don't want to make assumptions, meaning we don't want to just say, I think this person is feeling this way just because of one detail. You want to really dive deep and find the details so we're not making an overgeneralization. And what that word means is we don't want to make an assumption about what we think without really looking at those details. So, analyzing our character's point of view, that really just means that we'll be talking about how we can research characters' perspectives and how important it is to recognize that not all characters think the same way. But before we even can start talking about other characters, we need to make sure we understand the character we are talking about. Therefore, readers are cautious about making assumptions. And we're going to talk a little bit further about what that means right now. So, when we're talking about a character's perspective, as you see here, while reading, we see and experience things that are occurring in the text. And we take into consideration how the characters are feeling and their emotions. And we're kind of looking at the story through their eyes, through their lens, or we call that perspective. So, really, what that means is perspective focuses on how the narrator perceives what is happening in the story. So if we were talking about the Tiger Rising, one of the main characters is Rob, and we actually experience everything from his point of view. And that brings me into just a quick reminder of what point of view is. So point of view refers to who is telling the story. So perspective and point of view are very similar. And to kind of consider point of view, you think about, is the narration being done by the person who experienced something, or is it retelling of what occurred by someone else and maybe they weren't in the story? So, anyway, not to get too confusing, point of view is really who's telling us the story. And the big picture is it focuses on the type of narrator used. So sometimes it's first person, sometimes it's second, or sometimes it's third. But really, what I want to focus on with point of view is who is telling the story. So let's get started. So there are ways that we can avoid making assumptions or even guesses on how to further describe a character and their point of view, but it's actually really simple. And a tip that I want to give you is when you're discussing a character, you just need to be specific. So you're specific, and when you're unsure, you just say, okay, who am I actually talking about? So, to kind of continue with that, if you're unsure, who's telling the story, which I think all of us are able to do that, we can start thinking about figuring out perspective. Whose eyes are seeing this story? Whose thoughts am I hearing? Whose voice is telling the story? So, when you are considering perspective, these are just some tips you can think about as we're working. So, an example that I want to talk about is the text The Tiger Rising. And I would like to just really discuss some of the characters. And I'm going to focus on Rob. And this is just an example of what I'm expecting you guys to work on today during your student activity. So, again, we're talking about perspective and we're talking about how we're really thinking about the character's point of view and how do we know? And how do we know they're changing? How do we know what they're feeling? So it's really all about how do we know this person is telling the story and what details can we find to support it, to figure out how they feel and how they change. So my first try at this, analyzing the character, keeping in mind their perspective, I just wrote Rob is a shy person. He probably doesn't have many friends. He seems like he's always sad too. He made friends with Sistine and he thinks she's crazy. Now, all of those ideas are what I understood that Rob thinks. This is coming from Rob's point of view. This is his perspective. Um, there's, but there's not enough here. Thinking about if we're going back to what I was saying earlier, you need to be able to explain why. And part of that is you need to go back and find details and you need to support what you're thinking with the text. So let's see the second time I tried this. And you might be thinking, wow, this is a lot more writing, but you'll see how it actually supports my thoughts deeper. So I kept all my thoughts the same, but if you notice here, I discussed his point of view, how he changed, and his perspective. So Rob is shy and keeps to himself, although Rob changes throughout the story. The change begins slowly as Rob becomes friends with Sistine, just as I mentioned here, but I'm including a lot more details, evidence to support my thinking. One of the first examples of how Rob's character is changing is when he changes his policy of not speaking, when he first sits with Sistine on the bus. After Sistine leaves that day, he chants his mother's name, which is the beginning of his opening up and letting some of his grief come to the surface. When he confronts Sistine with the truth that her father isn't coming to get her, it represents another example of how his character is changing. So do you see how easy I just kind of went back into the text to further describe my simple sentence, Rob is a shy person? I'm analyzing this character from his perspective. So these are all ways of how he changed, but I'm talking about it from his point of view. Finally, from Rob's point of view, he realizes that he knows things he didn't even know he knew. This is a culmination of his change in character as he's becoming more aware of his own thoughts and feelings. Rob's perspective of trust was that it was hard to trust people at first, but that slowly changed as he became friends with Sistine and went through his experiences with her. So again, I've been thinking about Rob and his experience, but if I was to talk about Sistine's point of view, or her perspective, it might sound a little bit different. She might say that Rob, she might be thinking, well, she became friends with Rob and he's really weird or something else, but that's her point of view. But I was just focusing on Rob and his character. But I want you guys to really notice how I went back from this first section and then I was able to think about all the points I made, but I further supported it with details from the text. And that's really all the work that we're doing today. So for today's work, I would like you guys to think about the read alouds from our unit of study, and I want you to think about the characters in those stories, and I want you to think about their point of view and maybe how they changed over the story or throughout the story and their perspective. And then I want you to go back into the story and find details that support their change or their point of view or their perspective. So really, I want you to consider who are you talking about? What character? What are they sharing with you? What are they experiencing? What are their emotions? And you're going to think about how they change. And when you log on to our Google Classroom, you'll see the graphic organizer that's there to help you fill it out. So again, start thinking about some of these stories and what you would like to share about the character.